All right. Thank you, Bobby. And yeah, regrets for not being able to have Karen join us. She was certainly excited about having this conversation with Brien as well, but as Bobby said, Brien and I will absolutely do our best. So we're here to talk about the intersection of politics, policy, and innovation. And what a great landscape, actually, thinking about what the conversations that the preceding panels have had around the innovations in AI, grid advancements. We see so many dramatic things going on right now in the energy landscape, not foregoing even the political and the regulatory side, significant compounding pressures, dynamics of increasing cybersecurity threats, the thrust with clean energy, while trying to maintain energy affordability and grid resiliency. And these changes, at scale are significant enough, not to mention the regulatory implications and the policy imperatives that, can be enablers or, sometimes obstacles that we need to be able to overcome. So first, let me introduce our panelist here, Brien Sheahan. Brien is I'm happy to have him join us. Brien's a lawyer by trade, former chairman and CEO of the Illinois Commerce Commission. He's also served on the board of directors of NARUC and chaired its task force on innovation. He's held senior policymaking and cabinet level positions in the administrations of 3 Illinois governors and was an attorney on the staff of the ICC. He's an officer in the state political party, elected official, and has spent more than 35 years in and around Illinois government and politics. Brien's worked as a senior consultant and advisor in the utility sector and served as a lobbyist in the commercial transportation sector. He's currently a vice president for North America for a leading truck OEM and continues to be an active advisor in the utility energy industry. If you would welcoming Brien to the stage. Okay, Brien, before we jump into it, I think let's just kind of summarize some of the context of what we see as the operating environment, that the modern political environment and policy environment is in. I've broken it down into 5 key issues and or priorities that are really on the macro landscape for what we're driving in terms of the industry. The first I categorize as decarbonization and energy equity. And a couple quick stats that I pulled up for these. And so according to the Clean Energy States Alliance, over 20 states in the U.S. have renewable portfolio standards that aim for at least 50% clean energy by 2030. However, as we've heard, challenges remain around energy affordability and accessibility for marginalized communities, as highlighted by the National Renewable Energy Lab, which reports that energy burdens are continuing to be disproportionately high for low-income households. And number 2, the affordability challenges, in the face of rising costs. The average U.S. residential electricity price has increased by over 15% from 2021 to 2023 due to higher fuel costs, supply chain disruptions, infrastructure demands. However, with these rising costs, affordability remains a central concern as utilities balance investment in clean energy and resilience with the need to maintain reasonable rates for consumers. And we'll come back to that topic in a little bit. Number 3, ongoing regulatory and political shifts. The IIJA 2021, the IRA of 2022 have collectively dedicated over $60 billion for grid modernization, clean energy, and resiliency programs. But despite these investments, there's still regulatory hurdles that persist. Utilities are needing clear guidance to ensure long-term alignment of these investments to secure returns amid the evolving landscape. And as we talked about data center growth, electrification, infrastructure demands, the DOE projects a 20% increase in electricity demands by 2030, driven largely by transportation electrification. And as we've all heard now, simultaneously to that, the growth of data centers is intensifying, with data centers consuming about 2% of total utility U.S. electricity and expected to grow by 4.5% annually. And finally, climate resiliency and cybersecurity. The U.S. utilities incurred over $165 billion in losses from climate-related disasters in 22 alone. And additionally, cyber threats to the energy sector are escalating with nearly 50% increase in reported incidents over the last 5 years, according to CISA. So with that, those aren't daunting enough challenges as it is, for the energy landscape. And notably, here we are on election day, Brien. So first question, just macro level, Brien, if you can help set the stage for us. What is the current state of politics in the United States?
Well, I mean, I think we're all living it. I won't belabor it too much. Obviously, polarization, widespread public dissatisfaction, significant differences on major issues, and evolving party dynamics. But elections do have consequences, and one candidate will win, and that's going to have a significant role, really, in shaping the energy policy landscape as we go forward.
Yeah, and I forgot to mention, this is a bipartisan conversation that we're going to have up here. So now maybe let's flip it a little bit, and so that is the state of politics. Describe the state of energy policy in the United States.
Well, I think it's going to largely depend on what happens today and in the next few days. A Harris victory, I think, will involve expanding the Biden administration initiatives, the IRA, the legislation you've mentioned, significant investments in renewables, and really policies that favor decarbonization and stricter environmental regulations. And almost the opposite will happen if Trump wins, kind of a reversal of climate policies, a bolstering of fossil fuel production, a shift away from renewable incentives. But that may also create some opportunities for traditional energy sources, and there may be some wrinkles. About 2/3 of the funding of the programs you mentioned are being spent in Republican districts, and so there may be some kind of latent support to keep those.
Yeah, no, it makes perfect sense. Thank you. Drilling into, a little bit more on the role that the evolving energy policies have had in utilities, and let's use decarbonization as maybe the lens for this one, Brien. So what role have the policies played? That's one. And number two, the relationship between policies and utility accountability when it comes to how we think about the implications and the roles that each have, and I believe they do, in terms of driving those kinds of initiatives forward. And again, we can use the context of the goals that have been laid out, in various states, that utilities have signed up to, just about the dynamics between those two functions.
Well, I think, the role of climate policy obviously dictates the behavior of utilities. That's kind of the nature of regulated monopolies, and that's what that's what it's been for 125 years or so. In terms of accountability, I think there are different ways to think about it. Utilities respond to the statutory or rulemaking framework that they have, and that in and of itself creates some accountability. If you're talking about sort of the idea that utilities have kind of a broader responsibility to society, then it gets trickier because they don't earn on that necessarily. They're very conservative. They really don't do much without asking for permission first, and so that accountability, if you will, really originates from the laws and the regulations under which they operate.
Yeah, it makes sense. And it's a fascinating dynamic in terms of how that, as you said, almost the social conscience, or the other elements, that may influence. It could be any utility's behavior, versus what may be pure and sole earned rate of return on a regulatory program, and or a technical implementation, in terms of how the functions and the desires have changed. I'd offer, it certainly appears, that those other elements of decision-making and driving factors are seemingly becoming more and more a part of the conversation, in terms of, doing good, while you're continuing to evolve, the rate-making return of what your entity is. Would you agree?
Well, I think I'd agree to an extent. I think that there definitely is pressure from large customers, customers that have their own climate and sustainability goals. There are pressures from investors who have ESG concerns. And, I think this has always been true, but it seems like it's more true today. The community stakeholders have a voice that they're exercising in the process, and that definitely has influence, not only on the utility, but on their regulators and on the governors that appoint them.
Excellent. Let's shift a little bit. I want to recognize, here we are, at the fourth annual Utility Broadband Alliance Conference. We're talking a lot about technology and innovation and, adoption cycles, et cetera. Let's frame this from the perspective of, say, the utilities' approaches to resilience or cybersecurity preparations, all the while they're facing the challenges with electrification. What are the technology changes or evolutions that will need to come into play to address this? And do you see, kind of anything specific on the regulatory front that will help enable, or, to the negative, be an obstacle as they're pursuing any of these endeavors? We just heard a lot about AI, for example.
Yeah, I think that, one thing that we're experiencing now in the industry that is relatively new is growing load. For many, many decades, load was essentially flat. And so, the spike in load from AI, from transportation electrification, we could do a whole panel on that topic alone, is really, I think beginning to change the dynamic a bit. The need to invest in physical infrastructure for resilience and safety, is closely tied to affordability in the mind of a regulator. There are no hard and fast rules, but, around 2% of median household income is sort of a guide for the kinds of burdens that households can have. So, there definitely is tension between, the need to harden the grid, the need to integrate renewables and DERs, batteries, modernizing transmission and creating some backup and redundancies, and the ability of customers to pay for it.
Yeah, no, I agree. Let's jump to that question. I kind of call it the paradox that all of these major strategic drivers that are really forcing utilities to think about investments in resiliency, investments in grid reliability, preparations with cyber defenses, the clean energy transition, at the heart of it. These are massive investments, right? We are, rebuilding a lot of the infrastructure in the grid that, is a century, if not decades, old. And, it's hard to deny that's going to take significant capital, over many, many years to be able to drive. So that's one side of the equation. Obviously, you're right. We are dealing with the reality that, energy alone has become a more significant share of wallet for consumers, over the last many years. And the idea of, the ability to pass that burden through, to the ratepayers is becoming more and more challenging as we see the macro impacts on cost of living and inflation and all of those elements outside of even what we're seeing directly in the energy supply. And so how do you round that out, and kind of how do you see the thought process, or is there places of creative thinking, that can be tools that are brought to the table to help us move that ball forward?
I wish there were a clever answer to that question. I think I want to touch on something that Phil Moeller mentioned earlier, which is that state utility regulators they're political creatures. They're appointed by governors. They don't tend to have technical backgrounds. They tend to only serve for 3 years or so. And, the winds of political change can shift. We spoke earlier about net metering in California and the companies that had made really significant investments in net metering, only to have that rug kind of pulled out from under them. So I think chasing kind of the latest political, fad is somewhat risky. Utilities and I think the broader ecosystem, need to make sure that their decisions are really closely aligned with the politics in a particular state. I mean, these are political decisions. They're made by governors, by appointed officials, and they can change. And sort of the backdrop of all of this, and I think California is another good example of this. Arguably the most progressive, small p progressive state in the country in terms of grid modernization and integration of renewables, but it comes at a cost. And there is a breaking point even for Californians, and they've reached it. And so, I think you're going to see this more and more. This is just kind of a nonpartisan political observation, but if you look at the governors who have been most aggressive on utility rate making in the last couple of years, it's been individuals that sort of have their eye on the presidency itself. It sort of speaks to, I think, the power of the politics of a lot of these issues. So, on one hand, we need to make these investments. We need to decarbonize and transition, but it's not cheap, and there's a difficult balancing act to have.
Yeah. Do you think there's an appetite for that investment ultimately, in the regulatory, and in those environments today?
Yeah, I think it depends. I think in some states where there's, if you think about that, increasing utility bills to sort of follow the rate of inflation. Now, this has sort of been thrown out of whack, in the last few years, but for decades, many decades, utilities basically invested at a rate to sort of keep pace with inflation. Mm-hmm. And if you sort of think of that as a budget, they allocated their capital and so forth and would make the returns that they needed to make. I think the difficulty that we have now is, very high inflationary environment. It puts pressure on the utilities' ability to finance. It puts a lot of pressure on customers' ability to afford. And, in states like California, politicians like the governor have said, enough, we can't do it anymore. And so I think in some places, in Illinois is another good example of a jurisdiction where not only did the PUC sort of signal a direction, and the governor himself signaled a direction, but they actually used disallowances to try to address the rate impact, which, that's the worst case scenario. But it's, I think that in many jurisdictions, many states, and for many utilities, their customers have reached the sort of the breaking point.
Yeah, no, I would agree. Yep. Here's another kind of corner case that I think is relevant, when we think about data centers for a minute, and the current conversation around third-party engagement to help with some of the generation capacity and stuff that we've been hearing about. So the kind of behind-the-meter, version of small-scale nuclear. What role do you think third parties can play or should play, in terms of helping with some of this, given they have a different, they have a different commercial model, potentially a different opportunity to drive their investment thesis outside of the landscape?
Yeah, I think that's a good question that really is at the confluence of this issue of, kind of progress and affordability. The FERC said that that wasn't going to be okay because they're concerned that, that kind of taking that load out of circulation, if you will result in higher costs for other customers. From the standpoint of decarbonization and climate, co-locating data centers and other high load needs, I think you're going to see a lot of this in transportation, particularly commercial transportation in the next decade. Makes a lot of sense. But, you've got that sort of concern of affordability and cost creeping up again.
Yep.
So I think it's not going to go away. It's only going to grow. And so I think the challenge is to figure out how you can spend and get ready for the future, be future-proof, and be able to scale with relatively modest investments in the early years.
Yeah. So the time horizon, for example, right, kind of how we drive the investment plan over years, and I think we've seen a lot of that, in some of the, the regulatory or the financial packages and stuff that I've been seeing and studying, certainly the tail feels like it's being extended in terms of some of the capital programs. I'd argue some of that, I think, is also a function of just the time it takes to do some of this stuff, right? Some of these programs are so large in scale, it's hard to contemplate it within a traditional 3-year budget cycle, for example, and so being able to extend some of those costs, I do think is a benefit. Let's speak to budgets a little bit, and budgets from the perspective of business cases, and how, general speaking, kind of the regulatory structure looks at, profitability, ROI, against an investment thesis or plan. We were chatting a little bit earlier, I'll say it seems like somewhat an anomaly, but things like cybersecurity to me, and I use it as a generalization to really describe categories of issues where we know investments are needed to be made. I think we recognize the threat and the reality of that. Arguably, it's somewhat hard to quantify the cost of a massive cyber event, and what the impact of that can be. I find as an industry, and we see some of this in storms and stuff like that as well, is that we're quite reactionary in terms of how we look at costs and impacts after the fact that no doubt have an influence as we drive policy. I think we would all agree, kind of a major regional or God forbid, national level cyber event with foreign actors, would have a consequence of the scale that none of us have really ever seen before. But my question really being, how should utilities and the regulators think about building business cases and kind of value justification for programs like that, which are somewhat I'd categorize as kind of black swan, where it's huge, it's meaningful, hard to predict. I don't think we've got a full perspective of what the cost would be of that. But what's your thought?
Yeah, that's one of the weaknesses, I think, of our current regulatory paradigms that are focused on concepts like used and usefulness and sort of discourage pre-building. Cybersecurity is a good example, I think. This has been in the news lately, but there are a variety of foreign actors, China prominent among them, that are actively penetrating our infrastructure networks with malicious intent. So how does a state regulator think about a utility investment to prevent that? The kind of traditional idea of prudence is, you kind of boil it down to, is it a good idea based on the information that you had at the time? And I think we're at the point where, a lot of these issues do require investments, notwithstanding the affordability issue, and that's one of them. I share Phil's concern for the security of the grid and what may happen in a worst case scenario. It's pretty scary stuff, and it's worth investing. When I was chairman of the commission in 2015, we set up the first office of cybersecurity and risk management for any PUC in the country. dedicated, staffed-up office. We had professionals with an expertise, and we did tabletop exercises, and we had to drag the utilities along a little bit. There was some reluctance there, but I think they ultimately saw that it was worthwhile. And, you know, the result was that we gained a much better understanding of the problem, and it was easier to support that spend, and it's massive. And I think the same could be true for some of these other categories of spending.
Yep.
You know, the obligation really, though, is on the industry to educate and engage the regulators and frankly, governors. I think governors don't get as much attention as they deserve because ultimately they appoint the utility regulators in most cases, although some are elected. And, you know, that's a good conduit, you know, through which you can reach the PUC. And, you know, as a regulator, I was always concerned with air cover. You know, who's got my back if I'm going to take a tough vote. And if you know your governor's got your back and you're making tough decisions, then it makes it a bit easier. So I think the short answer is that, you know, there are some categories of spend that we just have to do. And cyber is one of them for sure.
Good. Obviously, it's near and dear to, you know, our hearts here. You know, obviously there's a significant enhancement to your cyber defenses by building private, right? Creating some isolation, this concept of a virtual air gap from the public networks. Let's come back to, you know, kind of center of the bullseye here for the Utility Broadband Alliance audience. I want you to put yourself back in your seat, you know, as a commissioner, you know, in Illinois, and, you know, assume the utility, you know, is coming to you with a proposal for an investment plan around a broadband wireless network. How would you look at that? You know, what things would be important to you or areas that you think really drive the justification for that being a prudent and smart, you know, kind of large-scale investment for them?
Yeah, obviously, you know, you'd look at sort of, you know, the need, the prudency, you know, whether this is a good decision, you know, what the risk is, what you need to do to, you know, ensure safety and stability of the grid, and really, you know, protect against some of those future uncertainties. Future proofing was one of the main topics that we dealt with on the NARUC Task Force for Innovation. You know, how do regulators allow the utilities to spend on technologies that they won't have to reinvent or sort of put aside as circumstances change? And so, you know, I think, you know, in a case of broadband for utilities, I think it's a good example of a technology that can really bridge a lot of different systems. You can consolidate, you future-proof because it's scalable. So I think it would meet a lot of the considerations that I would have. I was asked as a commissioner, you know, to consider public utilities, which was just a non-starter for me. It was not something I was willing to do. It was not a risk I was willing to take. You know, I think there are probably no greater threats that we have than a cyber attack on the grid. I mean, it would threaten, you know, civilization, you know, itself. It sounds pretty dark to say that, but, you know, this is kind of the world that we're living in these days. So I think that's one area where you know, there's strong justification for spending what we need to spend.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Obviously, I think that's probably, you know, a good, strong resident message for everybody in the room, you know, given what we're trying to do to transform this industry. I'll say, just kind of connecting back to, you know, some of the, I'll call it, implications of really modern technology, right? I think that kind of sits underneath what you were saying a little bit is, you know, I'm sure as a regulator, you know, for a lot of years, investment programs and theses were fairly well packaged around bespoke outcomes, right? You know, if a utility was targeting, you know, a solution for, you know, grid resiliency or smart metering or whatever it is, they were fairly well understood, right, kind of end to end about what the pieces were and stuff like that, unless business value trying to be derived from future, and other aspects and stuff like that. I think what we're seeing as a general matter with the modernization of technology, and I'd say broadband kind of broadly fits within that category. It's a solution, a piece of technology, that is there to build and expand on, right? So it'll do many, many things to start the day, but the capabilities that it unlocks to help the efficiency, perhaps, even to help with affordability, by, investing in technology that can grow with you as you expand. It's a different way of thinking about technology, and it comes with its own life cycle and upgrades and stuff that are really look towards the future. Is there other dynamics at play, in terms of how a utility should think about packaging that story is really where I'm going, that really better captures the way that a regulator thinks about that investment, both for today, but also looking towards the future, which may live outside, of what the regulatory view is or the financial view is of what the package is that they're entertaining.
Yeah, I think it really goes back to your question about sort of the strategy behind utility investments, and you have to make sure that they're aligned with the politics of a particular jurisdiction. And so if you're in a state that has climate and sustainability commitments, that has incentives for renewables, or even mandates for renewables and battery storage and so forth, weaving that narrative into what you already know their goals are is really essential. And getting, the commissioner to sort of be able to make that leap from, what their goal is, to the technology that's needed, to letting them actually do it, paying for it, is the trick. I think we've seen some of this dynamic around smart meters, which, in places like Illinois, we're virtually 100% built out, which was something I was proud to do as chairman of the commission. But there were critics who argued that, the cost benefit wasn't there and it would never really amount to anything. And there's still some states, to this day that haven't made those investments. But I think what we're seeing is that solutions are growing out of that availability of data that really have customer benefit. And I don't think it takes that much imagination to see, the potential of that, or the potential of broadband connectivity among, millions of DERs on a system, the possibility of virtual power plants and monetization. I mean, it's all technology that, I think is coming. And, it's a matter of convincing someone who sort of already sees that vision to let you pay for it. Make sure you have the air cover to do it.
That's fantastic. It reminds me to a point you made earlier, the importance of ongoing investment in education, with organizations like NARUC, and other kind of state regulators, that I think a lot of people probably don't fully realize, it's just where all these state regulators come from, right? And they're not all, in fact, I would say in most cases, they're not necessarily stewards of the industry, right? They haven't been around, kind of grown up like a lot of folks in this room, in and around energy and, energy policy and all those kind of things.
And a third of them are gone every year.
True, yeah,
So,
and they're rotating while you're at it.
Well, I wish they rotated. I mean, for the most part, they're out of the picture. They come and go, right? So.
But it's a strong point that, obviously for all the utilities in the room, I mean, you all have immensely impressive regulatory teams, fail none that I've ever met, have been just spectacular, and do absolutely important work in terms of trying to help support your utilities, with that education, and certainly to the technology providers. We have a role too. There's a lot of opportunities for us to engage in those organizations to be able to help them with that base level of education. I think, as you said earlier, around, kind of the other technologies and stuff, you guys were delighted to hear people come in and spend time with you. It helps drive the education and awareness of the big picture about what modern technology does, and it's well worth the investment of time. I want to flip a little bit to, kind of existential threats. We've talked a little bit about some of the big picture issues. Cyber, I would say, could potentially fall into that category. But let's actually use environmental impacts and wildfires as one. I would say it's relatively, maybe not entirely new, but one that's front and center of mind, a little bit more recently than it had maybe multiple decades ago, with the idea, of the potential for utility-caused wildfires bankrupting a utility, and how should the utility, and the regulators construct that conversation to understand, a little bit about what's the right thing to do, to stay out of that. Obviously, that outcome is bad for everybody, as it plays out. Or what should just the role of the regulator be, or the role of the utility to prepare for that?
I think there's a responsibility probably on both the utilities part and the regulators part. So, if you look at some of these incidents in California that involved, literally century-old infrastructure, infrastructure that the utility itself had said, we need to replace for many years. The regulator was aware of it and didn't insist that it be replaced, didn't sort of follow up. So, I think there's responsibility on both the regulator and the utility to say, let's take an honest look at what is required for safety and reliability, which are, really the primary concerns of utilities. And then, we need to show some courage when it comes to assessing the cost. You can imagine, in hindsight, burying power lines in California seems like a no-brainer, right? I mean, it costs 10 times as much per mile. But, when you think about the lost lives and the property damage and so forth, there's an interesting kind of an aside on that topic. We vacationed one year in a home next to a guy who actually worked for the Forest Service many, many decades ago and predicted all of that. And they allowed development notwithstanding, his warnings. So, it's really incumbent, I think, on public officials, on regulators, on utilities to have a really honest conversation about, what the situation is, what the risks are, what the costs are. And then, as a former elected official, I can tell you that, it's not easy to vote for higher taxes. But as a regulator, it wasn't easy to, have rooms full of people who, genuinely had trouble, paying their bills. But, there are just some things that we have to do as a society to make sure that, our infrastructure works and is safe and doesn't hurt people. And there's a cost to that. So I think it's, again, sort of going back to Phil's admonition, educating state regulators and governors is really, really essential to all of this.
Yeah, that's excellent. So one last question. Let's project forward a little bit. Get your crystal ball on, kind of elections behind us, where we're going. What would you say we should be on the lookout for from a policy side, just macro, kind of what do you think the general trend line would be, that if there's a direct correlation to kind of what we're here talking about, fantastic. If not, so be it. But where do you think we should be looking?
I think, this really is going to be a consequential election. I think a lot of it will be determined. I think it'll largely be pace rather than, ultimately whether we'll transition to electrification or whether we'll decarbonate. I think that, if Trump wins, that process is going to be slower than it would be otherwise. If Harris wins, it'll be somewhat faster, but I think the concerns over cost, are going to be ever present. So I don't think the trajectory is going to change that much. I do worry a lot about, and in my current job, I support our supply chain risk management. I do worry about kind of geopolitics, and I worry about geopolitical conflict and what it could have potentially on businesses, on utilities, on people's lives. And so I think we have to take a very sober view of what the world looks like, what the risks are, and prepare for them.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Brien. Hopefully everybody found that an insightful conversation. Please join me in welcoming and thanking Brien for his time. And enjoy the rest of the afternoon.